Last week on High Dive, we were talking about agitation, and we're going to talk about it more. How you doing tonight, Lee?
I'm doing well. How you doing, Jason?
I'm very well. I'm not agitated, so that's good. But actually, before we start, I want to draw people's attention. You had some really great stuff going on with the backstory, the show that you're doing every day on Sputnik Radio. Now, for some reason, my image is not showing up here, but you're doing your regular show on Sputnik News Radio with former CIA officer and whistleblower John Kiriakou. And you had, basically, he's like the godfather of whistleblowers, Frank Serpico.
As played by Al Pacino. In a
Well,
film
I thought it was funny
from my
that
childhood.
Serpico, he doesn't like Sidney Lumet.
No, apparently, yeah, he's pissed off at Lumet. But, it's his story, and it really happened.
And they changed it.
And so any changes he's going to notice, you know what I'm saying? But, yeah, that was a great episode, and it was neat talking to somebody who, again, Serpico, classic Al Pacino film from when I was a kid. And to talk to the real guy, and he's had a very, very interesting life. And both John and I thought, and then we also had Frank Strange on Tuesday.
Charlie Strange.
What's that? Charlie Strange. Forgive me.
Yeah.
Forgive me. And I had Frank Serpico in my head. We had Charlie Strange on the show, whose son Michael Strange was part of SEAL Team 6, and then in a chopper that went down under unexplained circumstances in Afghanistan. And we did, both John and I thought were two of the best shots. They're very good. Everyone liked them. And I'll tell you, the thing I like hosting a show, I talked to John after the show today. And I talked to you, Jason, way more than I talked to John.
Wow.
If you take the radio out of it, you and I talk on the phone.
Right.
We're friends, right? John and I never talk like that, like once every 3 or 4 weeks. And the reason is I like to keep it on the air. Does that make sense?
I totally get it. And what I would say is, most of the time when you and I are talking, it's got nothing to do with the show. It's just other stuff that's going on and everything. And I like that. There's a different style to each show that I do on Crowdsource the Truth that's mostly driven by the co-hosts and just how they like to work. You generally, on the day of the show, send me a short text or Twitter DM about what we're going to talk about. But before we move off of that Serpico show, there's just one thing I want to straighten out, because I got the impression that you might have misunderstood something that I said in last week's show. I did not mean to cause you to think that I was denying the involvement of Saudi Arabia in 9/11. And I also don't want us to go down a 9/11 rabbit hole, but I'm very aware of the 28 pages.
If you heard me on the radio show, I talked about that a little bit.
Yes.
I said you and I were both stepping gingerly, because forget right or wrong for a second. 9/11's a topic that we could, if we started talking about it, we could talk about it for 4 hours. Does that make sense?
4 years, 40 years.
Yeah. And it would slide into that. And neither one of us wanted to make the show about that. So we're both being careful. It's not even right, wrong. You know what I'm saying? It's nothing about that. It's you and I last week were both aware, well, okay, there's the 9/11 thing. And it just wasn't the topic, and isn't the topic this week. We can do it as a topic sometime. But
we should in the future, but I just want to clarify, because what happened was, a part of what I said gets relayed, and then I could tell that John Kiriakou took away from it that it's his impression now that I don't think 9/11 involved Saudis, and that's not at all the case. So we'll revisit that in the future, and I'd love to speak to John about it.
Next time you're on my show with John, let's mention a little bit and not get into a big discussion, but talk about it. And I was saying to John, because like I said, we rarely talk, and I'm going to let people in on a secret. You know this because you're friends of me. So when I talk on the radio, and it's the same thing here, I may talk a little about, let's say, my divorce. And I try to make people feel like it's everything I'm saying is legitimate. But I want people to feel like they're part of a radio family and that they're hearing something from me. However, you know that if I talk about the divorce on the radio, I'm giving 1% of it. Does that make sense? And I'm not speaking badly about anybody. It's just,
and the other thing is, of course, you want to be careful to not say anything that's going to agitate any of the other participants in the legal proceedings of the divorce,
or my kids, whose mom loves them and they love their mom, of course, and it's a difficult situation, but periodically, and John's going through a divorce and lawsuits and stuff, so periodically he and I talk, and we really talk. Does that make sense? It's like, okay, here's what's really happening. And it's not that we're faking it on the radio. Does that make sense? It's just, we're really not getting into the, I filed this motion, I've got this hearing date, this accusation is going to be made or whatever. And, but, I still think there's enough where it makes for good radio. It's real, but I don't, I'm limited in what I talk about. But I was saying, one of the things I like about hosting with John is that he and I will really get into it sometimes, but it has never once the next day been like, hey, this guy's still pissed at me from yesterday. Right. Hey, this guy's out for me. And John, and I think I do it too, John will admit when he like, for instance, when we first started the show, if I brought up Soros, he is a guy who's he's never identified as a Republican.
Right. Libertarian, I think he says.
That Soros is a Republican boogeyman. Soros is not a Republican boogeyman, period. And he's not even the equivalent of the Koch brothers. Now, again, that's another discussion. But my point is, there's real, because of his international scope. And by the way, Soros is not a funder of the left, except in America. In Ukraine, he's a funder of the right, the Nazis, if you use that definition of left and right, actual Nazis. Yeah. And so John's come around on Soros. He's like,
good.
Yeah. I mean, most people don't do that.
And most people
most people in media never do it because they can't, because he's the guy on the left or whatever, and I'm the guy on the right, and we're supposed to blah, 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 which they've never made us do at Sputnik. They've never said, you guys need to fight more. In fact, my old show, we fought too much, and both of us were moved on to other shows. And like a good divorce, hopefully you're happier afterwards. And but and Sputnik got custody of my son Shane, because he now hosts Fault Lines.
Well, he hosts Fault Lines now with Thomas.
With Jamal Thomas.
Yeah.
Who's going to be next week going to cover in Geneva the Putin-Biden summit. Now, but I really like the fact that I really like hosting. I liked hosting with Garland. When it was good, it was good. But John, I've never had the sense it's personal, and I like that. So there you go. So if people listen sometimes and John pisses them off, I understand that. And I get a little pissed sometimes too at his position on certain things.
See, that's what I was going to say. He's an interesting guy, Lee, because sometimes I
Yes.
feel the same way. His position on things piss me off, but he's just such a, and he's not trying. He's just kind of a very likable guy. So it's hard to be pissed off at him, but he says things that I'm like, what the hell are you talking about?
Yes. Yes. And in fairness, I'm sure I say things, I know I do, that he's like, what are you talking about? We got into a discussion about Tulsa a little bit. We talked about Tulsa a couple of weeks ago. And on some things, we're not going to resolve it in the next 10 minutes. Does that make sense? Like,
Absolutely.
there's no way. And the mistake that John makes, a general mistake he makes, and it's a very establishment, grassroots Democratic mistake, is he's the kind of guy, if he finds an article on Snopes or at the National Archives or something, that seems like gospel to him.
Wow.
And it's very hard to talk him out of it. For instance, he was saying today that Hillary Clinton in the late 60s was a Republican. Now, I pointed out that she was friends with Alinsky, wrote about Alinsky, and in New Haven at the Black Panther trial was supportive of the Panthers. He was like, no. It says right here on fact check that that's a myth. She was supporting the ACLU, who was supporting the Panthers' right to a fair trial. The Panthers not only got more than a fair trial, and this relates to the agitation thing we'll talk about, none of these murderous commies, these Black Power radicals, were almost ever convicted of anything. Huey Newton killed a 17-year-old hooker. Huey Newton shot at a cop. Angela Davis was part of a murderous rampage, the Marin County Massacre. She wasn't in the building. She bought every gun that was used. She bought with the guy who's the brother of the guy she was in love with. So she's in love with George Jackson, his brother Jonathan Jackson, who was 17. She goes around to buy the guns and is there when the shotguns are sawed off. Wow. Obviously, she was part of the Marin County Courthouse massacre that led to multiple deaths, including a judge who had his head blown off. When she was found not guilty, one of the white jurors gave her one of those, little Black Power. And that was in the paper.
Wow.
I found it in my research. But the Panthers were like invincible. They were hardly ever convicted of anything. And
wow.
And to argue that they were somehow getting an unfair trial in New Haven in the murder of a Black Panther member who was 19, I believe. I believe Alex Raxley was 19, member of the Panthers. They thought he was a snitch. They tied him to a bed, poured boiling water on him to torture him, gave him a people's tribunal that you can hear the people behind it doing it. Erica Hudgens, you can hear it on YouTube. If you look up Alex Raxley torture, you can find the audio of it. And so dead to rights, absolutely dead to rights on this thing. No one got off. And Hillary Clinton was supporting it and Alinsky. But again, it's just like, no, but she was she worked on Watergate.
Well, Goldwater, I think, probably would cause people to think that she was a Republican because she was working for the Goldwater campaign. But actually, I'm glad you brought this up because maybe she was in there trying to screw up the Goldwater campaign.
But
anyway,
when was she working on the Goldwater? That was 63 or 4, right?
Yeah, she's always said she's a Goldwater girl, right?
I know, but when? That's what I'm saying. When?
Oh.
In the 60s, because that Panther trial was in 69. That was when she was at Yale. Prior to that, she was at, I want to say Brandeis, but I'm wrong. I forget where she went to college in Boston. It's not Brandeis, but it's close.
It's Wesleyan or something. Wesley.
Yes.
Yeah.
Angela Davis went to Brandeis.
Right.
And Wesleyan and Brandeis are both schools I was never going to go to. So I'm just saying, I view them that way. And I was never going to go to Smith either. Just saying. And so her MA thesis at Wesleyan was about Alinsky, and she was friends with Alinsky, and they exchanged emails.
Yeah, it's really crazy. I got a question for you, Lee.
Yes.
So this is Huey Newton, right?
Yes. The servant. Yes.
Now, so this seems like a pretty, they've set this up, obviously. He's sitting in a special kind of chair. He's got these things, they look like African artwork to me or something on the zebra.
He loved this photo, by the way.
Okay, but what is this spear? Is this like Neptune's spear or something? What the hell is that?
It's an African warrior spear. All the stuff is related to the African nationalist, broad African nationalist movement that the Panthers were part of. And I have a book. Let me get the book recommendation out of the way, because you can find it for free. And the book is Black Power. And the authors are Stokely Carmichael, who changed his name to Kwame Ture. And I forget his Charles Wellington. I forget the guy's last name. But if you look up Black Power Stokely Carmichael, you'll find it. And you can find it free in a PDF version, so you can read it without paying a dime. You can go buy
That's
it.
Cool.
I'm not, but go ahead, find it. And this is a book published in 1967. And this book is exactly what's going on today. This is the book where the concept of institutional racism or systemic racism, they mean the same thing, was first introduced and brought up. And it's actually in chapter 1, they lay out the definition, they say, of racism. And I'll talk more about that. I'll get deeper into it we got to go to the other section pretty soon. But basically he lies, and he starts the book by saying, people use the term racism, but it's not defined. Well, that's not true. It was pretty well defined, but he's saying it's wrong, basically. And this book, they talk about the solution for systemic racism. Do you know what it is? Do you know what the system is? When they say systemic racism, do you know what they mean by the system?
I think they mean just beating up and killing any white people.
No, they mean capitalism. That's what they mean. They were communists. And when people talk about systemic racism, they don't mean, well, you need to modify things around the edges. They mean you need to get rid of capitalism. And that's what this book argues. And this is on a week when Joe Biden twice in the past 10 days or so described systemic racism as one of the crises of our age. And you know what's interesting about it is there's a sense in which everybody would agree with systemic racism. What I mean by that is, if there were laws that if you were black, you can't go into a white bathroom.
Yeah.
That sounds like systemic racism, right?
Yes.
In other words, it's not an individual guy saying, hey, boy, don't go in that bathroom.
Or if you're not allowed to run for president if you're black or something like that.
Right. But that's not what they mean. And they pulled this switcheroo. The Democrats have pulled a switcheroo. That is not what they mean. Because we don't have any of those laws anymore.
Right.
I
think that there is some legacy real estate stuff in certain states and everything, so there is some validity. But what you're saying, I agree with. That they're trying to paint a picture that the whole country.
And I'm at a point where I'm urging everybody, don't accept one iota of it without doing the research yourself. Like you
Right.
just said, the thing about there was redlining, and I've heard that in the real estate thing. You know what?
I didn't
I'm
check it.
not going. What's that?
I haven't checked that. You're right.
Right. And here's the thing. If I had been going, I'll give you an example on this Tulsa thing. And my producer, Rod, on the show, Rod from Philly, who's done a great job. You've dealt with Rod. Rod
Yeah.
was a fan of the show. And when I had to hire a new producer, I said, this guy's great, very smart, a big fan of the show, knows what we do. Let's bring on Rod, and he's done great. So Rod's Black, and he says, here's the way the story's told in the Black community. There was this thing called Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And it so enraged white people that they destroyed Black Wall Street and killed 300, at least, Black people. Now, the 300 number's wrong. We talked about that before. But let me ask you a question. Why was it called Black Wall Street?
I don't know very much about it at all.
I didn't know much about it either, but this is why I'm saying I do now, and I'll explain it. And if I'm wrong, someone feel free to correct me. I asked about it on Twitter earlier. I don't think this is wrong. I'm saying I've gotten to the point where I don't believe anything anyone says about the race narrative unless I know it to be true. So they say it was Black Wall Street. Okay, what is Wall Street? When you picture Black Wall Street.
I got to stop you, Lee, because we're almost out of time.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure that people know before we get over to patreon.com/Stranahan or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth or subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. I want to let them know that I've created a new YouTube channel for High Dive, Lee. There is a channel now, in addition to Crowdsource the Truth Forever, because so many Crowdsource the Truth channels are getting, slammed. I've created High Dive with Lee Stranahan, where people can watch. I'm starting to load up, back episodes of your early appearances on Crowdsource the Truth, which, by the way, you were one of the very first interview subjects there was. And now people can enjoy simulcasts of our live streams on the High Dive with Lee Stranahan channel. But we're going to go in depth on all the stuff that we've been talking about here in just under 5 minutes. Yeah.
One more thing on that. I've hired somebody, someone who I've worked with before, Kisha, who does a great job. She was part of Citizen Journalism School, and I'm paying her money. So please sign up and join. So I'm not, right now, with the number of Patreon subscribers I have, I'm losing money. But
we'll change that.
No, I don't care, because what I want to do is make sure the content gets up. I'm good at talking. It's hard for me with everything I have to do.
Yeah.
To do the stuff of like getting things posted. It is. I know.
Totally understand. I know a lot of people think it's no
loser.
big deal, but people want it posted this way, that way, the other way, whatever it is. But we'll be going in depth on this. I also want to ask you about this pipeline hack, because it seems like everything gets hacked by Russia, but we're out of time to discuss it here.
Okay.
I haven't seen any evidence that it's been hacked. I know you are a hound dog when it comes to finding evidence. So we're going to talk about that pipeline alleged hack in just 5 minutes. Join us, everybody, on patreon.com/Stranahan, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, or subscribestar.com/